1950s, not so urbanized. Only like the big countries in the 1950s are urbanized. By 2020, most of the countries are urbanized. Philippines not yet included, but by 2047, let's just say 2050, Philippines will most likely be a urbanized country as well. So that's why we need urban planners. And then over here is the map showing Metro Cebu, basically the group of cities and municipalities in the Cebu province, sort of working together as to like pool their resources to create some kind of roadmap for sustainability. So about again 3 million people by 2020. Oh, excuse me, by 2020. I need to update this because I just forecasted this in like 2019, so the data should be out by now. Okay, so what is urban planning? Again, it's an ongoing, collaborative, often political process of managing physical form, economic functions, and social impacts of a city. So all of you have touched on this in your essays, where planners and experts need to collaborate with LGUs and officials, public officials, to create some kind of plan, like a comprehensive land use plan, zoning maps, some kind of approach to manage population, especially growing populations in urbanized areas. And this will have impacts on the physical form, the economic functions and activities. I think activities would be better. And the social impacts of your city, municipality, or barangay. And I also included here what is urban? It's basically any city, town, region, or subdivision that has a higher population than the surrounding area. So, like any place can be urban. It's just a matter of like how many people are living there. So the scope of urban planning, just like to familiarize ourselves. So this is like an older, what do you call this, diagram. The newer one is in your canvas. So it's pretty much the same. Identifying stakeholders and the site, identifying the issues of your site, placing a vision, and then instead of short-term experiments, that's your monitoring and evaluation, and also implementation. Okay. So there are different definitions of urban areas if you depending on your country. In the Philippines, it's when a barangay has a population of 5,000 or more. All the cities, municipalities, and barangays you showed had populations of definitely more than 5,000. Also, if a barangay has at least one establishment, meaning like a mall or something commercial, with a minimum of 100 employees, that area is called an urban area. And also, if a barangay has five or more establishments with a minimum of 10 employees, or five or more facilities within a 2 kilometer radius from a barangay hall. So, thinking about the size of the area and how many people are either living or working in that area. Australia and the USA have similar definitions. I'll just let you read that and watch it during the video replay. But it still has something to do with the number of people living in a limited area, in a confined area. Not really confined, but like a defined space. And then we have here zoning maps, something that urban planners will undoubtedly need to like make and work with. This I just use Antipolo because it was the best looking one compared to like Cebu City, which is very low quality and not even updated, I think. And then urban design is when you design the space between buildings. So urban planning, it's all about the 2D, the map making, the data analysis, and the like provincial, city, and even barangay level, but mostly handling everything that's 2D, like just locating where would be the best areas to place whatever activities that site needs. And then the nitty gritty of it goes to the urban designers, so the space between buildings, because architects handle the building, landscape architects handle the landscape in different sites. So that leaves urban designers with the space between different sites. So let's just say sites because we're a class composed of architects and landscape architects. And then we'll continue with the history of cities. This is for like my other class, so this is not such a big deal for our um, urban and environmental issues. But I'll discuss this like next week because it's like a little bit long. But I just wanted you guys to know about the difference between urban design and urban planning. So different scales. So we really like sort of dividing the built environment into different levels so that they can be properly managed. Because before urban planning became a thing, like in the let's say late 50s, 1950s, there was like no concept like managing the city like properly. So it was handled by engineers, architects, other construction professionals, landscape architects as well. But now the thrust is more like including everyone who are not like building professionals, social sciences, economists, to have like a more holistic approach to like managing development in cities. So we'll skip this urban planning, we'll skip the history, and then go back to that next week. The next thing I want to like discuss with you guys tonight is the sort of urban sprawl and how it connects with sustainability. And as we all know, all our cities have like definite boundaries. We're seeing different rates of population growth all over the Philippines in our different areas. And then how do we sort of manage these populations and these developments to like so that we don't end up with sprawl? Because basically, I have some objectives here. Uh, just skip that. Urban sprawl is the rapid expansion of geographic extent of cities and towns. Typically, these are low density residential housing. So important to identify that because low density anything, whether it be residential, commercial, etc., is really something that we're trying to get away from because, as we know, population is increasing and we only have a finite amount of land. So it's all about mixing use now, preventing this like inefficient development of like cities and municipalities and barangays. And then also, urban sprawl relies so much or very heavily on private automobile for transportation, like the cars. So we're talking about improving accessibility across our different areas so that people without cars can still move around. So we're gonna thinking about mass transportation, cycling lanes, pedestrian lanes, improved sidewalks, and of course, together with that, when you improve the public space, you're also improving the utilities of those public spaces. Your flooding should be mitigated, and hopefully, your power should be more consistent. So, how does this connect to urban sprawl, like power and flooding? Because if you spread out very fast over a short amount of time, your utilities cannot keep up. So that's what we're going to like discuss in a few slides. Something that's been happening in the US, and then I'm sure some of you have seen as well in the Philippines, especially in Cebu City's downtown area, is the urban blight. So, this is the degradation of the built and social environment that accelerates migration and what you call this highlights inequalities in an area like in an urbanized area. So, what is urban blight? It starts out at any of these points. It's either the neighborhood is declining, it's becoming dirtier, less maintained. This is happening in downtown Cebu in our like older heritage districts. And because that area is very dirty and not maintained, population tends to shift outwards into the suburbs, into the urban peripheral areas, so like outside to the newer green fields. And then what happens when population moves out of an area? The city budget, the barangay budget, goes down because usually, ideally, taxes are the main form of like income for governments. And then after that, because the government in that local barangay, that municipality or city runs out of tax revenue, they can't maintain their utilities. So services get cut. That's why you have poor, what they call this, poor drainage facilities, power outages. It could be one because the area is expanding so fast, or two, the government just doesn't have the budget to like create those utilities. And because of these cut services, you'll have fewer customers, businesses won't be profitable, so they'll move out of that area again, which leads to again decline of your neighborhood, like dirt, the uncleanliness, and informal sectors, all that stuff. So this is really why sustainability has become very popular in the past decade, because we're thinking about how do we develop cities where the population would want to live there, be comfortable in their local areas, and have like opportunities, um, sort of to keep them staying in that area, because really, again, there's just we only have limited amount of land. And on top of that, we also have the problem of climate change. So increasing temperatures, global temperatures will lead to like melting of the polar ice caps, which also leads to more erratic and more severe, what they call this, weather patterns. So back in, let's say, 2015, 2010, there was an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to sort of mitigate the increase of temperature. But for the Philippines, we're not really big enough to contribute to carbon emissions. But it's not really a bad idea to manage our carbon emissions even today, even though we're not the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases in the world. That just gives us more incentive to start planning for sustainability right now. And then over here is a map of Cebu City. I forgot I didn't have notes here, but anyway, if you can see the red line over here, where my mouse is. By the way, can everyone see my mouse? If not, you can just look at the YouTube video later. Anyway, this area in red is supposed to be a natural reserve, because these are the slopes here is too steep to develop, and if you do develop, it will come at a very high environmental cost. You have to dig deeper. You'll be exposing lower areas to flooding and landslides. So ideally, Cebu City should not be developing anymore further into our mountains, but instead revitalizing our downtown areas. This will prevent flooding, hopefully mitigate the cost of like increased utilities, so you don't have to build your electrical lines and water lines up all the way to the mountains, which also mitigates flooding and the chance of power outages, because you're spreading out your utilities too thin. And then let me see, what time is it? Let me just check. The 7:48. So let me just talk about a few books that were recommended to me by the previous what they call this person who handled this class. So Managing Community Growth by Eric Damian Kelly highlights how you can sort of control growth in a city by looking at the availability of public services. So 5 assertions of cost of availability of public services, meaning like your water, electricity, and what we didn't really talk much about tonight, telecommunications, like phone, internet, etc. So here are Sir Kelly's 5 assertions or principles. So a program that limits new development will ensure the availability of public services. So makes sense. So if the government has policies and programs that sort of regulate development or limit, he even says limit, so just stop development entirely, that will ensure the availability of public services, mainly because you already have the existing services and you don't have to add more as you spread out your barangay, city, or municipality. And number 2, the program or policy that establishes boundaries based on criteria other than the availability of public services may or may not ensure availability of services. So it's basically the opposite of the first one. The second one just says that if you don't put a limit on development, then there's a chance that that development will have problems getting water, electricity, and internet or telecommunication services. Third, over the long run, the policy or program should ensure the availability of public services, and then there will be imbalances. And of course, there will be imbalances in the short run. So if the city can't help it, or your barangay or your municipality really wants to expand, there really can't be any way to have zero imbalances, meaning some people might have more water than others. But hopefully the program should, or the policy should, in the long run, make sure everyone has access to water, power, and internet or like phone lines. And then fourth, the policy should encourage, or that encourages new development to take place in areas with existing public services have lower capital costs. I'd say if they develop in areas with existing public services, they would have less capital costs, like less development costs. So that just makes sense. So all of these things are very like common sense stuff. So just something maybe to keep in mind during your next meeting or your next sort of proposals. And then over here, finally, increased distance equals increased capital costs and increased operating and maintenance costs. So this means distance from your city center. So if you're going to be working in like what do you call this, development authorities in your area, this makes a lot of sense. And that it's really just a struggle of talking with your mayors, your barangay officials, to sort of control them from developing more and more out, uh, or spreading out the city. So that will just increase costs, and that will increase what do you call this, capital costs and maintenance costs, because really you're making more service lines, more power lines, and that's what's happening in Cebu City right now with our like spaghetti wires in for electricity. And I think the track record, or like the record of like keeping where are all our kanang potable water lines are, I'm not sure MCWD has a clear map of that, or like it's not publicly available. And in Cebu City you will see like what do you call this, potable water lines, not even underground, they're just built on the sidewalk, or where the sidewalk would be, and it's just a blue pipe together with other pipes just like exposed. So if that pipe gets damaged, an area or like a small group of houses might lose water for like a couple hours. So that's very inefficient. And then of course the water is spilling out into the sidewalk. So you're spilling water, you're making it more inconvenient for people living in the city, which is like not good. And then of course, if you have good public services, you will have like you will be able to balance the demands for public facilities and capacities. Some examples here are like in Westminster, Colorado, which we'll look at in much more detail in the next few slides. So basically, the message of Sir Kelly in his book is that what do you call this? Growth management programs. That's what GM means. That directly regulate the adequacy of public facilities, succeed in ensuring the availability of public services or new development. So basically, if you limit growth, or if you have policies and programs in place that limit or regulate growth, then you should be able to sort of solve a lot of the water supply problems, electrical power supply problems, which all of you, I'm glad to say, have already like pointed out in your essays. So that totally makes sense. So I'm sure all of you are like familiar with this. So I'm just gonna skip here to some examples. Unfortunately, these are like American examples because this is an American author. So some websites you might check out: Urban Land Institute and the American Planning Association, for some like research data on like whatever fields of interest you might have. So these are good websites, and a lot of like researches and publications are readily available. So you can just like go here, look for a topic you're interested in, and you can pretty much download anything you want. So New York, 1960s. So we have here Sarasota County in Florida. So down here near southeastern side of the U.S. And this is the boundary. You can see the developed areas are along the coast, and then their mountainous or hilly areas are like reserved for parks, sort of similar to Cebu City and most of the other I say not countries, but the cities and barangays and municipalities you guys showed. So typically, it's a normal pattern for urbanized areas to like sort of conglomerate or like come together near the shoreline. So just some population data here. So 1940s, they had a growth rate of 29%, and they spiked in the 1950s at 279%. So this was after World War II. The economy of the U.S. was like rising. There's so many jobs, and Sarasota County was one of those areas that benefited from those from the economic growth. So much so that by the 1960s over here, population growth rate went up to 166%. So that's almost a little less than double. Oh, excuse me. And because of this rapid population growth, the city needed to have a growth management plan in place. So, rapid development required improvements to the management of infrastructure systems, water treatment systems, solid waste districts, water supply, etc., etc. So because their government working together with their like local experts were able to manage growth, you can see that Sarasota today is one of probably one of the better looking American cities. So over here is like an image from the I think the 1970s. I think I forgot to put down my sources, and this is a city. This is what the city looks like around like the 2000s. So you can see how cleanly it developed. Everything seems to be managed. Even like a nice sport area over here, and they were able to maintain green spaces for their coast area. So that's a success. And then let me just skip here to a city that didn't do too well. Let me double check. Can't remember. Yeah. So I'll just show you two examples so it's not doesn't take too long. So this is Ramapo in New York. So a little bit north of New York. So if you look at the area today, it's like mostly rural, and then it has an area of 160 square kilometers and a population of 126,000 people. So just a quick overview here. Population growth reached its peak in the 1970s at 120% almost. Let's just say 120% down here. 1970s they had 76,000 people, but because they didn't have a growth management plan in place, you can check out these points here by pausing the video when you watch the recording. After their boom in like the 1970s, a long decline. Town officials voted to dismantle the system in favor of a program to stimulate economic development. That program didn't really push through. And if you look at the demographics here, the population data, 2010, their population growth went down to like 16.2%. So it's not as small as the towns and like municipalities in the Philippines, but compared to its peak where it went up to like 70 and even like 30, 50 back, even back like 1910s, they really don't have sorry, they really don't have that growth anymore, meaning they couldn't sustain that growth and people started moving away. So what you end up with is a like a fairly rural town. We can't really judge the quality of life, but this is more of a focus on how their utilities weren't able to keep up with the population growth and people will move away. So thinking going back to the Philippines, in Palawan, compared to everywhere the rest of the Philippines, your densities aren't so high, but you have that very high growth. So expect that issues on utility management, like you're already experiencing it now, the flooding, the power interruptions, that those will definitely need to be addressed. And the sooner you have policies in place, the sooner you get your government to act, the better it will be for your area in Palawan. And then Cebu Province, Region 7, we're already like almost reaching, not really reaching NCR properties, but it's getting really crowded. If you live in the Cebu Province, you really feel that traffic congestion, even during the pandemic. And then for those who live in the Mindanao region, still. So what we have here is that if your area is not highly dense, it will be because those less dense areas tend to have higher growth rates. So something we need to look at later on, maybe next meeting, is maybe if you guys can calculate your growth rates for your areas, or like just put in a table or put in a graph, because we can sort of compare how fast our populations in our areas are increasing. And then because they are always most likely increasing, then we have to answer the problem of sustainability. So we have limited resources, we have limited land. How will we manage that land? And that sort of connects with urban planning and urban design, making sure everything is working. And then if not, we have will the problems of flooding, criminal elements, lack of water, power interruption will persist now until like someone else like manages to fix it, or if nobody fixes it, then what will happen is that our areas will force, because of how unlivable it is, people will be forced to move away, and then we're stuck with the city with inadequate utilities, and then no way to fund like to fix it, because really the funding comes from the people living in our areas, and then government plays a part in it, I know, but ideally, if we have the population managed, we have the utilities managed, we should be able to get if we had good governance, we should be able to maintain and create sustainable cities, barangays, and municipalities. So that's basically it.